Thank you so much for allowing us to speak today. Before I start with introductions of the Unity Project and who I am, I'll turn it over in a moment to Dr. Erin Carriotti, because I think most of you probably came to see him. His work is unbelievable, and I'm excited to hear him speak as well. Do me a favor, just humor me for a moment. For those of you that have children under the age of 18, raise your hand. Those of you that know someone that has a child under the age of 18, raise your hand. Keep your hands up, by the way. Okay? Yeah, if you know anyone that has a child under the age of 18, keep your hands raised. I know you're all eating, but I'll try to make this quick. Those of you that work in the state of California or know someone that works in the state of California, everyone should have their hands still raised, right? And if there's anyone left that either still doesn't know anyone that has someone under the age of 18 or works in the state of California, those of you who love freedom, raise your hand, right? That should be everybody in this room. And I'm going to talk in just a moment about why I'm asking those questions. Can you guys hear me? Is this?
Yeah.
You guys can hear me without this, speaking into this?
No, you need the mic.
Maybe in this? Okay. All right. Can we turn this on?
I think that's just for the recording.
Just for the recording? Okay. So, the Unity Project is an organization that was formed to, are you guys hearing me okay? Yeah. Okay. So the Unity Project is an organization that was formed because we recognize that in the state of California, parental rights are being taken away, and they're being taken away at a rapid pace. So what you're being faced with today in the state of California, I'm going to give you guys some bills. I know you're eating, but if you have a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen, I encourage you to write these down because these are really, really important. AB 1993. For those of you who don't know what AB 1993 is, it's a bill that states in the state of California, you're going to have to prove your vaccine status in order to engage in any type of work, whether you're an independent contractor or an employee. So that means that you have to prove through a vaccine, either card or passport, whether or not you're vaccinated in order to have any type of ability to support yourself and your family. AB 1749. These bills, by the way, are incredibly scary to me, but AB 1749 states that all schools will have to provide a form of testing for COVID-19 for the teachers, students, as well as the staff. So my question would be on that one, if you're requiring vaccines, why do you have to test? But we'll get back to that in a little bit. AB 1797. That's a vaccine passport. This one is particularly disturbing. And some of you may be familiar, but I think it's worth repeating these bills, just so you know what's on the horizon and what's at stake in the next few weeks in the state of California. AB 1797 is a vaccine passport bill that will merge 3 California immunization tracking systems into one statewide system. SB 866. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of SB 866? Show of hands, please. So SB 866 should scare the heck out of everyone in this room. It states, it's a bill that is being presented so that the age of consent for vaccines and essentially medical decisions will be lowered to the age of 12. I'm going to say that again, lowered to the age of 12. So I took my daughter the other day to get her ears pierced. I had to show my ID. I had to sign a document stating that I'm giving her permission to get her ears pierced. But I do not need, after this point, if this bill passes, she will not need to get my permission to engage in medical decisions that could impact her for the rest of her life, right? That could impact her from a vaccine injury standpoint. And as we all know, we're going to learn more about this as this presentation goes on, and I'm sure Dr. Kheriaty will dive into the science behind it, but could also end her life should she choose to take the COVID-19 vaccine without my permission. Okay. AB 871. So this one is also particularly disturbing. AB 871 states that it's going to be added, the COVID-19 vaccine will be added to the already existing list of vaccines that are required for children to enter school. Why this is particularly disturbing is there's a myriad of reasons, but one of the things is buried within the bill, or I should say is not buried within the bill, and this is a really important point. There is no mention that the COVID-19 vaccine needs to be FDA approved. So they want to, I want to recap this. So far, we're not even done with the bills yet. So they want, in the state of California, to make it so that you can't engage in any form of employment without being vaccinated, essentially creating a black market, right? They want to make it so that you cannot go to school or work without being tested. They want to make it so that you have to have a vaccine passport. They want to take away parents' rights to make informed medical decisions for their children and hand it over to the children. And they want your children to be injected with an experimental vaccine, and I say vaccine cautiously because, as we'll discover, this is not a vaccine, right? And they're going to do it without FDA approval. AB 2098. This one is going to be particularly interesting, and I'm sure Dr. Erin Carriotti is very familiar with this. But this is a bill that states medical providers essentially must promote vaccines. So this bill says that it classifies any anti-COVID medical opinion as not lawful. Think about that for a second. So your doctor can no longer tell you, if this bill passes, your doctor will no longer be able to tell you their medical, scientific opinion. They must go along with whatever the government narrative is. SB 920 would authorize the medical board to inspect a doctor's office for records without a patient's knowledge or consent. I'm going to say that again. SB 920 would authorize the medical board to inspect a doctor's office records without a patient's consent. And this is the last one that I'm going to talk about, but it's probably the single most scary bill if they all weren't scary enough. SB 1464 requires law enforcement to enforce public health guidelines. That sounds like good shot number to me. So, and we'll go into more detail about that, but I thought it was really important today to kick off this presentation and this meeting with those bills, because that's why we're here. The state of California, if there was never a time before in the history of this country, and in particular the state of California, to rise up, it is now. If this passes, if these bills pass, you will no longer be able to live, work, or learn in the state of California. I'm going to say that again because I think it's worth repeating. If these bills pass, you will not be able to live, work, or learn in the state of California. And for those of you that say, hey, it's fine, I'm vaccinated, I'm fine. Think about the dangers of what those bills contain. If they can come in and forcibly inject you with something that is not FDA approved, that is experimental, they can take away your rights to privacy, come in, get your medical records. I want you to think about how dangerous that is to the individuals in this room and to our society as a whole. So with that, I'm going to back up for a second. As I said, my name is Laura Sextro. I'm the CEO of the Unity Project. We put together this organization because we knew that there were groups across the state of California in various forms and states of organization fighting vaccine mandates in the K-12 community. We launched with about 120 grassroots groups coming together to speak in a unified voice. We're a conduit of collaboration, and we've assembled what I think to be is one of the finest boards, and Dr. Aaron Kheriaty is on our board. He's our Chief of Medical Ethics. I'm going to let him introduce himself in just a moment. We have Dr. Robert Malone as our Chief Medical Regulatory Officer, and we have Dr. Paul Alexander as our Chief Scientific Officer. I think you guys are probably all familiar with Dr. Robert Malone. Is there anyone in here who has not heard of Robert Malone? I think you all have. Dr. Paul Alexander, he's not here, unfortunately, he's supposed to be here today. He has a unique background. He was actually a senior consultant to the World Health Organization at the very beginning of the pandemic, as well as the NIH under the Trump administration. So he brings a tremendous amount of knowledge on this subject and how this impacts, from a scientific perspective, the human society. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron and let him introduce himself, and then we'll dive into some more of the presentation.
Thanks. Thank you, Laura. I just always wanted to do that. I'm not sure why I did. But sorry to startle you. So for 15 years, for really the entirety of my career in academic medicine, I'm a physician. I was a professor of psychiatry at the University of California in Irvine, just down the street. And back in July, I published a piece in the Wall Street Journal arguing that the university vaccine mandates that were being rolled out were unethical. They contradicted central principles of medical ethics, like the principle of informed consent, that someone cannot do a medical procedure on you without your permission, or in the case of a child who does not have the capacity to give consent, without the permission of the parents. And while I thought that people should have personal choice about the vaccines, we can get into the science of these particular vaccines a little bit later. I thought it was important not to force a medical intervention on people who didn't want it. So I made that argument very publicly. I knew that my own university, the University of California, was planning on initiating their own vaccine mandate, and they were one of the first schools to roll it out. All of these mandates began in higher education, by the way. Those were the first institutions to launch these coercive mandates. So in August, after the university went ahead and did this, I challenged the university in federal court, arguing that people like me who had natural immunity or infection-induced immunity after recovering from COVID, our immunity should be counted equally, because we knew at that point, with 150 studies on natural immunity, we knew that infection-induced immunity was every bit as good. In fact, it was better than the immunity that you get from vaccines. So the university was discriminating against me and my rights of equal protection because I had this form of immunity rather than the immunity from the vaccine. Well, one good way to get in trouble with your employer is to file a lawsuit against them in federal court. To make a long story short, shortly after I did that, the university put me on leave. Then they put me on unpaid suspension. Then a month later, they fired me. And then Laura came along and rescued me. So I'm very happy to be with the Unity Project now and continuing this work. But I was concerned about several things. I was concerned about a one-size-fits-all approach to medicine and public health, right? Where individuals were not assessed on a case-by-case basis. I was concerned about the coercion of physicians in medicine so that we couldn't practice according to what we believed was in the best interest of this particular patient who's under my care. I was concerned about the intrusion of other institutions and the government into the doctor-patient relationship. So there were all kinds of problems that led me to the point where I said, I need to put a stake in the ground here, and I need to try to defend at least some of the people who are being fired over these mandates for making individualized medical choices. And since then, I've dug into the science on these vaccines. And there's a couple of things that are emerging that I think are very important. The first is, as Laura mentioned, the next step is to try to make sure that all children are vaccinated. Right? The problem with that proposal, which can initially seem very attractive, because all of us are very used to childhood vaccinations, right? Measles, mumps, rubella, this sort of thing has become routine. So this seems like sort of one more virus that we need to defend children against. But if you actually look at the data on COVID, one of the only silver linings of this whole pandemic is that healthy children are not harmed by COVID. The very small handful of children who have died with this illness, and by the way, yesterday the CDC just revised that number down by 24% of children who had died. Oops, we made a coding error mistake, and the number is really 25% lower. But in any case, the number was already small, and it's even smaller now. And those unfortunate children, every single one of them, had very serious co-occurring medical conditions, right? So a child with a serious medical condition, talk to your doctor about whether or not you might need the COVID vaccination. For everyone else, children should not be put at risk. right? Because they're not going to benefit from this vaccination. The counter argument was, well, we should vaccinate children in order to protect others. There's two problems with that. One is it's now very clear that these vaccines that we have for COVID are not sterilizing, meaning they don't stop infection and transmission of the virus. It was obvious to me way back when I filed my lawsuit, if people who were looking at the data could see that. It's obvious to everyone now because they know after Omicron from firsthand experience that I got vaccinated, I got boosted, I still got COVID, or someone 1 degree of separation from me had that experience. So it's very clear that these vaccines don't protect other people. Even if they did, though, there's a problem with that argument when it comes to children, and the problem is this. If children are not at risk from this illness and we're vaccinating them only to protect older adults, we're essentially using children as a shield. We're putting them at some degree of risk from the vaccines, using them as a shield to protect grown-ups. And I think no sane society, right, should ever put children at any risk for the sake of protecting adults. Right? A sane and ethical and moral society does precisely the opposite, where adults make sacrifices on behalf of protecting children. And this seemed to flip that on its head. Another issue that has really come to the fore during this pandemic is the problem of a lack of transparency from our federal agencies. So the day that the Pfizer vaccine was authorized, the FDA was required under federal law to release the study, the clinical trials data on which they based that authorization. They didn't release that data, so I coordinated a group of doctors and scientists to file a Freedom of Information Act request to the FDA. The FDA came back after that FOIA request and said, yeah, we'll release it at 500 pages a month, which if you do the math would have taken 75 years to get the data for the Pfizer vaccine that the FDA reviewed in only 108 days. The judge said, no, you have 8 months to release it. Then Pfizer intervened, which was not surprising, and said, let us help the FDA redact the data before it's released. Again, not surprising, but what was surprising is that the Department of Justice lawyers representing the FDA agreed with Pfizer and submitted a request to the judge to allow the company to redact the data before it's released. We have a good judge in this case. Fortunately, he said, hell no. So that data is starting to trickle out. One of the early documents that was released several weeks ago shows 9 pages of serious adverse effects, just wall-to-wall lists of problems that go beyond the heart problems, the myocarditis that you might have heard about in the news. That's one of many issues that we're seeing with the mass vaccination campaign. All medical interventions have side effects, right? That's not necessarily a problem. You have to weigh the risks and the benefits, but you can't do that. You can't have informed consent without information. And now thousands of people, tens of thousands of people like me, have lost their jobs for refusing a novel medical intervention for which we can't even examine the clinical trials data. The final point I want to make before we go to Q&A, and there's many, many different issues that we could talk about here, but if you listen carefully to the list of proposed laws now in California that Laura described, what we're seeing here with this movement is what I call a kind of biomedical security state that's being advanced. What do I mean by that? Kind of a mouthful. This is the welding of public health with digital technologies of surveillance and control, right, starting with the mobile phone, and the police powers of the state, right? So if you listen carefully, the themes you heard in there were a lack of medical freedom, both for patients, for parents of children, and for physicians who are practicing medicine, right? Including restraints upon a physician's freedom of speech, right? So if I say something about the COVID vaccines, raising questions about efficacy, right? We know that the efficacy of these vaccines is declining with new variants. That's clear and obvious. I was saying that 6 months ago, and that was labeled as quote unquote misinformation. My only crime was being 6 months ahead of what everyone else is now recognizing and now saying. So if you happen to go against a narrative consensus that the government or the public health agencies are dictating, then you're basically at risk of losing your medical license. And losing your medical license for a physician is not even just like losing your job, right? I lost my job at the university. Now I'm working with the Unity Project. I'm starting a private practice. I'm going to be okay. But if I lose my medical license, right, I can't practice medicine at all in the state of California. This is a very serious penalty that we're talking about here that's going to muzzle physicians, and it's going to undermine the trust that patients have in their physicians. Is this doctor telling me what he actually thinks about this intervention for me, given my medical history? Or is he keeping information back because if he says something, he might get into trouble for it? Is he basically acting as a mouthpiece for unelected bureaucrats who are pushing a particular product or a particular agenda or whatever? Very serious issue. The invasion on privacy is probably the other theme that you picked up on from these laws, right? So why is there such a strong push now to vaccinate younger and younger populations with a vaccine that is, in a sense, obsolete? The vaccine was designed for the original Wuhan variant, which is no longer in circulation. It's not working very well at all against the Omicron variant. Probably the next variant is going to do even worse. So why are we doubling down, tripling down on boosters and so forth for a product that's no longer very effective? I think the vaccine push is as much about this intervention, it's only partially about this intervention. It's as much or more about getting people used to the vaccine passport, right? And even if you think this vaccine was a terrific thing, you were the first in line to get it, you think everyone else should get it. Nonetheless, and I respect that. If you've looked at the data and you've come to that conclusion, we can agree to disagree. But you should still be concerned about the fact that you have to show a QR code to get on a plane, get on a train, go to a restaurant, to demonstrate that I have been a good citizen and I've done what the government or what some unelected public health official has told me to do in order to access basic goods and services, in order to travel, in order to leave my country in the case of Canada. Right? This should be of concern to all of us, because once that infrastructure is in place and people get used to doing this, it becomes normalized, right? The temptation to use that for other purposes is going to be too strong. So what about the next proposed medical intervention that you may or may not want, right? Watch very carefully what's happening on the issue of climate change. Over the last year, climate change has been redefined from an environmental issue to a public health issue. Right, and all the headlines and all the rhetoric around climate change are focusing on supposed health harms to human beings. So it's been redefined as a public health issue. It's going to very soon be redefined as a public health crisis, right? Once the COVID crisis has exhausted its possibilities for surveillance and control of the population, there's going to be another public health crisis. For my money, I'm putting my money down on climate change as being that crisis. And again, regardless of what you or maybe people on the other side of the aisle believe or don't believe about climate change, think about giving the government authority over, something like, one day I get a text message on my phone, Dr. Kheriaty, we noticed your carbon footprint is 24% above other white males similarly situated in Orange County. And you have 18 months to convert over to an electric-only vehicle, and if you don't, we're going to tax your gas at an additional 30 cents a mile. And then the year after that, that tax goes up to 60 cents a mile. And if they nudge, if they squeeze, if they push, and that doesn't work, eventually somebody will just push a button, and I won't be able to buy gas anymore, right? And if you think this is a sort of fanciful future dystopia, pay very close attention to what's being proposed in terms of using digital technologies for public health surveillance and digital central bank currencies rather than a decentralized cryptocurrency system. All of these things are pushing in the direction of more data being extracted from each of us that can be used to nudge, coerce, or manipulate our behaviors. Right? And I think we saw the first major stage of that during the pandemic with vaccine passports. So the vaccine issue itself is important, but the infrastructure that was put in place to monitor and to encourage, to, in some cases, coerce vaccine compliance, I think is even more of a concern for those of us who care about individual liberties, the Bill of Rights, and our basic human freedoms. So I'm going to stop there, and we're happy to take questions and discuss any of these themes that we brought up today, from the legislation to what to what happened during the pandemic and the failed pandemic policies, to what I think may be coming in the next few years if we don't stand up and say no. And should people come up to the microphone to ask a question?
So probably to do this in the most organized fashion, maybe we'll just point out, and then are these microphones working here? Yes. Okay, so maybe we just sit down and we'll just call out.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
Before we take questions, let me just also talk a little bit about the work that the Unity Project is doing. In the sense that we are really fighting as hard and fast as we possibly can to protect the pediatric population and to restore parental rights. For those of you that don't know, the state of California is funding vaccine bans going around to schools. Is anybody aware of that? Just show of hands. A few of you. Vaccine bans, that's correct. I actually had someone say, kind of a joke, oh, is it like the white van that shows up, like giving candy to a kid? And the answer is yes, actually. They're literally showing up in vans at schools, and these are being funded by the state of California in order to push this agenda that Dr. Kheriaty was talking about getting full compliance with vaccination. And I just want to reiterate what he said with regard to the safety of these vaccines in the pediatric population. Children are not vectors of transmission. They are at statistically zero risk. Especially healthy children are at zero risk from this virus. So why are schools pushing so hard to and the government to take the right and choice away from parents and put it in the hands of children that they can then manipulate very easily through many, many different tactics. Usually the most effective tactic with the children is the social ostracization, of children in their schools. And then again, reflect back on those bills. Once they do that, once they get the kids to feel as though it's important for them to be vaccinated because all their friends are doing it, what is it? SB 866 lowers the age of consent down to 12. So this is how they're coercing your children, your grandchildren, your niece, your nephew into getting these vaccines, and then take the rights out of the hands of these parents. So with that, I think I want to leave enough time for Q&A. So Erin and I could probably talk for 2 hours straight about this topic, but we want to hear from you guys. So go ahead.
A lot of these jab centers, they do not produce the MSDS sheets. Now, as a business owner, I'm required under state law to produce an MSDS sheet, and they will not. Now,
So I'll just repeat the question. So the vaccine centers are not producing the equivalent of a manufacturer safety data sheet, which would be the FDA package insert. So
MSDS sheet, state of California.
So when you get a medication, you can unfold that thing that has all the data and the list of side effects on it. All of the vaccines that are currently available in the United States are still under emergency use authorization. The BioNTech Comirnaty vaccine that was given provisional full authorization is not available in the United States. That's Pfizer's partner. So if you open up the package insert, if you even get one, if you open it up, it's literally a blank piece of paper, right?
And it's a violation of California, CalOSHA.
It is, although if I could just say, it is.
And it's fines, penalties, and jail time.
So it is actually, under normal circumstances, and you bring up a really good point, but it is a violation of CalOSHA and OSHA standards to not provide that information. However, understand that the state of California and the federal government of the United States has used Emergency Powers Act to take away normal rights. So they've used that as a mechanism to strip away things that would normally not fly under normal judicial review or legislative actions, right? So because they're under an Emergency Powers Act, Cal OSHA actually does not have to go according to normal standards and normal obligations that they normally would. So therefore, they basically have carte blanche to act in what they think is the best authority for you without providing you this information, which is why the state of emergency that we continue to be in, Gavin Newsom, I think everyone in this room probably has a colorful nickname for him, but we'll just call him Gavin Newsom, has continued to extend the state of emergency. Why do you think that is? Because he would never be able to get away with what is happening unless you're under a state of emergency. States of emergency absolve normal practices.
Yeah.
So
that's the violation of constitutional rights then.
Well, this is a really important issue. The state of emergency issue is one that I think a lot of Americans are not paying sufficient attention to because it's happening both at the state level and at the federal level. Does anyone know who at the federal level has the authority to declare a state of emergency? The president has to ratify it, but the person who's authorized to declare a state of emergency is the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. Who is the current HHS Secretary?
Richard Levine.
No. It's a man named Javier Becerra. You guys remember Javier? Right? This is a man with no public health background or no public health expertise. He's a lawyer, former Attorney General of California, if I'm not mistaken. So after he did some damage here, he went to Washington, and he's the head of the agency. HHS is the agency under which we have FDA, CDC, and NIH. And on the 22nd of last month, Becerra, with the president's endorsement, extended the state of emergency at the federal level indefinitely, right? Now, a couple of things to understand about this state of emergency is that the threshold for what constitutes a public health emergency was never defined, and I believe that was deliberate, right? You would think if certain legal guarantees and constitutional guarantees are going to be temporarily suspended because there's some kind of enormous disaster that we're facing, right? You would think we would have to have some criteria to know when and how you can do that, whether it's hospitals being overwhelmed or case counts or death counts. If you read the president's letter from last month extending the state of emergency indefinitely, the only statistic he cites is the total number of people supposedly who have died of COVID. That's the only justification that's given, right? So there's no way to hold the governor or this administration accountable for these states of emergency if they can just do it with the stroke of a pen. So the public needs to demand checks and balances on that system, whether it's legislative review or judicial review, and clearly defined criteria that are made in advance legislatively if we're going to have this provision in the law where a governor or HHS and the president can declare a state of emergency and suspend ordinary legal and constitutional rights. It's a very important issue. I think we really should focus on that. We should focus on ending the state of emergency, but then long term, over the next year, we got to think about, okay, what needs to be put in place legislatively so that this sort of thing doesn't happen again, because it's an arbitrary and willful power grab, and we know that George Washington is the exception that proves the rule. Once people are in power, they're very reluctant to relinquish those powers voluntarily.
And if I could just add, and I'm sure Erin will have more to comment on this as well, but with regard to the metrics by which they're using, that they're citing the people that have died of COVID, they've also used the State of Emergency and the PrEP Act to essentially deny medical practitioners the ability to practice medicine. They have denied people access to effective early treatment, resulting in the death of many, many people that did not need to die. And so they're using those numbers to cite whether or not they should continue the state of emergency.
Yeah, if for the doctors that, the bill that you spoke about, I don't remember the number, about the government coming in and forcing the doctors to push the narrative of the vaccine, is there a place for good doctors to go or a network that they
Yeah.
where they can get support.
You want to talk about Robert's Network International?
Well, I mean, let's answer it 2 ways.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna answer that in a couple of ways.
Can you repeat the question, please?
So, sure. The question was, in light of the bill with regard to, and I apologize, you guys, there's so many bad bills out here right now, I don't have them all memorized. So bear with me for 1 second. I'm going to tell you what that bill is because I think they're important. It's important that you guys know these numbers because I'm going to ask you at the end, I'm going to give you a call to action it's going to be around these bills. But it's AB 2098 and SB 920 are the ones in particular that handcuff the doctor's ability to engage in medical practice. There are doctors in this country, obviously Dr. Kheriaty is one of them. There are actually quite a few, there are thousands of them, not only in this country but around the world, that are pushing back. And they're risking their licenses to do so. And there are groups, the Global COVID Summit is one of them. They're actually morphing right now into a different organization. The name is escaping me.
Yeah.
And let me back up. The question was, how do you access doctors, in light of these bills, how do you access doctors that are able to practice medicine? And I'm sure Dr. Carriotti will expand on this, but the answer to that is, should these bills pass, you will not be able to access medical care in this state, and because we know California is typically the tip of the spear, and as California goes, so does the rest of the country, you will not be able to access medical care with a medical practitioner engaging in the true spirit and practice of medicine. They're going to be handcuffed. So that's why it's so important that we know what's happening, that we stand up as citizens and remember that we put the government there, right? We are the government. We tell them what to do. It's critically important that you guys are all aware and know and write to your medical practitioners. Encourage your medical practitioners to push back. Encourage your congressmen and your senators to stand up and say that this will not be tolerated because unfortunately, although there are organizations that will form out of this, they will be very, very handcuffed in terms of what they can do because they will be losing their medical licenses. And we've seen it. I have groups of doctors that come to me and they say, hey, can you help us? Can you give us legal representation? They're losing their licenses for simply engaging in the act of treating a patient for COVID-19. Outside of the normal standards of remdesivir and intubating a patient, which we all know, it results in, what is it, an 80% death rate if something like that happens. So,
Yeah.
I'll let you expand.
So yeah, Global COVID Summit, I think there's 17,000 physicians involved in that. That's an international group. Frontline Critical Care Coalition, which was started by our mutual friend Pierre Corey, has a list of practitioners in every state, including some here in California, that are practicing good medicine and making available early treatments using generic repurposed drugs that have been shown to be effective for the treatment of COVID-19. So FLCCC, their website is a good resource to try to connect with a physician in your area, and Global COVID Summit also has a list of physicians who have signed their declaration in favor of medical freedom. So those are two organizations that I'm aware of that are helpful. And as Laura said, more I think will be springing up. The question is whether they will sort of legally be hamstrung and prevented from practicing medicine, right? An MD who doesn't have a medical license can advocate and can speak out, but he can't legally treat you. He'll be put in jail for practicing medicine without a license.
So to your point, you were talking about how federal and statewide they've been having emergency status, but unfortunately it's also very local at county level as well.
Yeah.
I've been following and doing research for well over a year now on this matter. My question is because Board of Supervisors actually in our county and all counties in the state are responsible for the emergency status.
Yeah.
And it is seemingly a bipartisan agreement that they are in this agenda for the digital passport. That includes the Republicans that are currently sitting, as well as people that have failed upward into the Senate and the Congress. Don't know if I should mention names specifically. Okay, so Michelle Speed was the chair of our Orange County Board of Supervisors when they signed illegally the vaccine passport contract in Orange County. And that was done under no bid contract terms because they were in emergency status. We have been fighting them for a long time. That being said, they're still there. They are going to be coming up for re-election. There's 2 seats coming open. And of course, Lisa Bartlett, part of those people, is failing upward into, I think she's going for Senate.
Yeah.
So my question to you is about 1/2 to 1/3 of the CRAs here represented are in Orange County. And I want to know if you can provide some action items and or recommendations for getting these people out. Thank you.
Laura, do you have any comments on
Happy
that?
to talk about that. That was a great question, and at the heart of why we're here, right? It never ceases to amaze me as I go through my daily life and I have conversations, whether it's at the grocery store, or the airport, or again, my daily life, how ill-informed people are, or just total lack of knowledge about what is happening. My husband and I were out yesterday in Santa Barbara, and we're having lunch, and he commented how it's amazing how we're sitting here, and we know that we are on the brink of total loss of our freedoms in this state and in this country, and everyone's just going about their life like it's no big deal. And so the question is, how do you get them out? Well, first and foremost, you need to start talking. You need to start talking on every platform you can, whether it's social media, whether it's physically going and speaking, going to school board meetings, finding candidates that you think can win. And then at the Unity Project, one of our goals, we actually, I always say we're not at a lack of strategies, we're at a lack of resources, right? Because there's so much work that needs to be done. But one of our strategies will be that almost like a political campaign, we want to start, we have a large group of volunteers. We have, as I said, we've launched with over 120 strategic partners in the state of California. So we have strategic partners in that represent essentially every county from Oregon down to the Mexico border in the state of California, and we want to mobilize those groups. So what I would encourage you to do is to go to unityproject.com, reach out to us. We will get you partnered up with a group of volunteers. You guys can canvass the area. The other thing that we do is we use a tool, and I think it's probably okay for me to speak about it here, but there's a tool called Align Act. And the best way to describe it is, for those of you, do you remember the scenario with Pepsi Corporation where the CEO had said that their entire workforce had to go through critical race theory training? Is anyone familiar with that? And if you remember, the CEO acquiesced on that. The reason for that is they used a tool called Align Act. And within 36 hours of making this announcement, the CEO was targeted and he was inundated with hundreds of thousands of emails expressing opposition. Things like, we're not going to buy Pepsi products anymore if you do this. So it sent him a message and he stopped. The Unity Project uses this tool, and we can target individuals. We had a campaign where we targeted the president of the Teachers Union, and within 36 hours, the president of the Teachers Union received 363,000 emails in opposition of the vaccine mandate. It's really important that we make these elected officials know there will be consequences, because they're doing this, right? They feel like there's no consequences. They feel like they're just going to continue to get reelected and reelected, right? I'm sure obviously something that this group addresses is election integrity. That is not the focus of the Unity Project, but I'm glad that there are people out there that are fighting for that, because we need to send a message to the elected officials through our voice and our actions that this will not be tolerated. So to answer your question, again, how to oust these people, you target them. You target them. And organizations like Unity Project and our strategic partners can help facilitate how to do that. Hopefully that answers your question.
If you call the Secretary of State and talk to Todd, he'll tell you that the source code on the Dominion voting machines, the computers, is proprietary, which means that the only people that can see that source code is Dominion. Nobody in the state of California, except for the vendor Dominion, can see the algorithms that are counting our vote. So the question is, since no one can see it, and of course Wall Street or a bank would laugh you out of the office if you walked in and said, hey, you can use my computer program, but I'm the only one that can count your money and see how it's counted. So my question is, how do we vote them out if we can't see how they're counting our vote?
Well, again, so Unity Project doesn't deal in, and I know Erin's got an opinion on this. We're not focused, let me rephrase that. I'm focused on everything that's happening in this country. I've been horrified, and I can safely say this. Unity Project is not a partisan group, but I can safely say in this company that I've been a registered Republican since I was 18 years old. So all of this concerns me. But what I can tell you that we do strongly encourage the Unity Project, and is a very, very powerful tool to send a message that has nothing to do with voting. You say to your elected officials, you say to your school boards, you say to your principals, if you choose to support and move forward with an unconstitutional, unethical vaccine mandate against my children or my grandchildren, you're going to lose your student body. I'm going to pull my kid out of school, and I'm going to homeschool my kid. And you know what? My neighbor down the street, we're going to get together because we're not in this alone. You know that old saying, right? It wasn't so old. It was this whole past 2 years. They said, "You're not alone. You're not alone in this." And I used to hate them saying that. Yeah. Right? Well, they're right. We're not alone in this. We will band together. We will pull our children out of school. And let me tell you something. And I know there's some school board members in here. If you lost 50% of your student body, I guarantee this would be a different conversation. So there are tools. They require some sacrifice. They require some standing up. I have a lot of people that come to me and say, "Oh my gosh, I don't want to miss that trip to Cancun. But I have to get vaccinated." You know what? That one trip could cost you a heck of a lot more than losing your trip to Cancun. So my advice to everyone, I'm imploring everyone to use these mechanisms that you have. They're actually much more simple than we realize. To stand up and say, we're not taking this as a society anymore. We have to, we'll pull our kids out of school, right? Did you want to?
Yeah. I don't know. She's a force of nature. You don't want to get in Laura's way. It's great to be working with her.
Quick question. Because federal law trumps state law,
Yeah.
have you reached out to any of your conservative representatives in the House or in the Senate
Yeah.
to find out what they can do to
Yeah.
possibly pass legislation
Yeah.
that would make this illegal in the state?
Right. So what can be done at the federal level? So about a month ago, back in January, Laura and I were both in D.C. for a Defeat the Mandates rally. Spoke on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, which was wonderful, 40,000 people there. But the next day, I think an even more important event happened, and that's Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin had a hearing, essentially a Senate panel called COVID-19 a Second Opinion. I was able to speak at that along with some other doctors and scientists. And so Johnson and several others in the Senate and a few people in the House certainly are interested in doing a retrospective on COVID-19 and figuring out what went wrong with our pandemic response. In fact, there's considerable bipartisan support for that idea right now, which is kind of interesting. Certainly, if things flip at the midterms, right? Ron Johnson is going to likely be in a position in which he's the head of the committee that can investigate the three-letter agencies, right? And so I think he's preparing for that. But there are actually there's buzz in Washington. I was just in Washington yesterday as well. There's buzz in Washington with several legislative proposals around these issues
Is
that.
there one that would end the state of emergency and possibly better define a health state of emergency in order to walk back Secretary Becerra's?
Yeah, I'm not aware of one yet, but certainly there's discussions about what needs to be done in that regard. The Senate did just vote to, to end
The American Emergency Powers Act, and then that they expect that to be vetoed.
Yeah. So the Senate is making some noise with passing laws that they expect to be vetoed or that may not get through the House, having to do with landing the plane on COVID. And the details of that I don't have at my fingertips. So there are things percolating, at the Senate. And look, if the House flips, I think these issues will start getting a lot more traction.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I asked because I'm running for the United States, so I'm curious to know what the Senate's doing. Thank you.
Yeah.
If I want to just jump in here. So one of the things, it's not related necessarily to what's happening at the Senate or the congressional level, but we all recognize that there is a need to get this information out to the American public. And I think in addition to that, we also need to get in the hands of some of these attorneys general throughout the states, the ability to go after some of these government entities that have contributed to what the state that we're in today. So we're putting on, and it's, bear with me because we're still we don't have all the details, and we're also not at liberty to go through all the details, but we're going to do something April 11th through the 15th. It'll be filmed in Nashville. It's called America's Grand Jury. And the concept is that we lay out for the American people all of the evidence, and this is not a reality TV show in the sense that it's fake evidence. This is real evidence. There will be real expert witnesses, potentially Dr. Erin Carriotti, Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Robert Malone, and others that will be there participating, laying out real evidence and overlaying them with real laws that these entities and individuals can be tried against. And the American people will be able to text in and say whether or not that this is compelling. And it serves two purposes. First purpose is to make sure that the American people understand what's happened in the last 2 years and exactly what this government has done under the guise of a pandemic. And then lay out the legal framework by which attorneys generals throughout, and particularly probably more red states, will be able to go after these again, individuals and government entities. So.
I just want to thank you both for all the work you've done. It can't be easy. I know a lot of us are on the front lines out here. Like Michelle, I've been fighting in Orange County with her and others. But the statement I want to make is we all have dollars. Now, we need to fight like Canada did, where the citizens started pulling their money out of the bank and then they freaked out and went back on things. We need to stop shopping Costco's and Walmart's and the big box stores. We need to stop using Amazon. We need to start supporting the local businesses. And we need to start educating the local businesses in what the future is to be. And that is the digital passport. And that is serious. Yes, it's with the vaccine, but we need to be speaking with our dollars.
Yeah. I want to comment on this.
Even if it's one-on-one.
What is your name?
Rieta.
What is it?
Rieta.
Rieta? Thank you for saying that. I cannot tell you, much to the chagrin of my daughter, how many stores I have walked out of in the last 2 years because they either told me that I needed to be vaccinated or I needed to have a mask on. And I simply said, I have a choice. I will not support any entity that is interested in either going along or being complicit in any way with what is happening in this country. And that is a very, very powerful thing. It's one of the Align Act campaigns that we will start doing. We can actually target entities much like they targeted Pepsi corporations.
Yeah. So, and I want to say a word about the lockdowns that we suffered through in 2020 and even on into 2021. And there's some buzz now. I think they're probably not going to be reinstated. But there's people who still think that they should. We are going to continue seeing COVID cases, especially since the vaccines are so leaky. And natural immunity ultimately will be our way out of the pandemic as more and more people recover from the virus. So this is a virus that we will learn to live with, and as children get exposed to it at young ages, they're not going to be vulnerable when they reach older age, the way many people now are vulnerable because they were never exposed to it earlier in life. So we have to keep doing whatever we can to protect and to more adequately treat vulnerable individuals who get infected with COVID, but the rest of us need to get back to our lives. But we know now that the lockdowns didn't work. They didn't stop the spread of the virus. Major study from Johns Hopkins just came out a few weeks ago reviewing hundreds of studies on lockdowns, and their conclusions were basically this didn't help, this didn't do any good, and in fact there was a lot of collateral damage done. I wrote a piece in 2020, October of 2020, called The Other Pandemic, which was the lockdown mental health crisis that was inflicted especially on young people, rising rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, drug overdose. You remember the opioid crisis, right? 2018, 2019, worst drug crisis in United States history, more deaths from drug overdose in those years than we had seen ever before. 44,000 deaths per year before the pandemic during that opioid crisis. Last year, there were 100,000 deaths by drug overdose in the United States. That's a statistic that nobody is talking about on TV as they continue to focus exclusively on one illness. So the lockdowns harmed many people. Why did we do them? I think there's many reasons why we did them, control and surveillance being one of them, but there were economic interests as well. Just if you follow the money, you see that there was a massive transfer of wealth during the pandemic from the working class and the middle class, not just to the upper class, but to the to tech elites, basically. Amazon, headquartered in Seattle, lobbied Washington, Oregon, and California in favor of lockdowns. It's pretty obvious why they did that. Look at what happened to Amazon's stock when people were stuck at home, when your local small business or your local pharmacy couldn't operate and went under. People were forced to buy their goods and services from the big tech, behemoth, because there was really no other options if you couldn't leave your home. So I think we have to recognize the enormous harm that was done during the lockdowns. They were framed, if you raised your hand and asked questions about whether this was a good idea, right? You were accused of putting money or economic considerations ahead of, trying to protect grandma. It was framed in that way, which was completely the wrong way to frame it. Why was it the wrong way to frame it? We know that economic harms lead to medical harms. Morbidity and mortality is affected by economic conditions. You cannot separate those two things. The fact that among working age adults, 18 to 64-year-old adults, in the last year we saw a 40% rise in all-cause mortality, in overall deaths. A majority of that rise was not due to COVID-19. What does that number mean? Just to put that in context, actuaries tell us that a 10% rise in all-cause mortality is a once in 200-year catastrophic event, like a major world war. We saw a 40% rise in all-cause mortality last year, a majority of which was not due to COVID. So the economic harms of lockdowns, the mental health crisis, the drug crisis, vaccine adverse effects that are being suppressed and not reported, these are all things, and these are numbers that the mainstream public health establishment is going to want you to ignore or not hear about. But this data is emerging, it's coming out, it's going to become harder to hide the harms that we did by misguided lockdown policies.
And this is, I'm sure, something that you're aware of. For those of you who know anyone that had a baby, is there anyone who knows anyone that had a baby during the pandemic? There is now a study that's come out. Any baby that was born during the pandemic, they on average, they expect that there's a 20-point drop in IQ. Does anybody know about the IQ scale? I think, what is the highest IQ ever recorded?
I don't know, 200?
200. The average is what?
Average is 100.
The average is 100. So think about what that does to our society and to these babies. There are babies now that are experiencing constant drooling, facial deformation because they have masks on them. There are babies that are not able to communicate because part of the cognitive development is that you see your parents looking at you and smiling at you and talking to you. You see your teachers doing the same thing, people in the general community. That has been stripped of these kids. And I know you obviously have a lot of information about that. But we could go on for hours about the side effects and the I say unintended, potentially intended consequences of what's happened in this country.
Okay, so thank you, Erin. Thank you, Laura, for everything you both are doing in your entire organization. My question, going back to Mr. Becerra, who apparently made a very subjective decision, okay, to call a state of emergency because he felt like doing that. So very subjective decision on his part. And of course, Biden and Newsom will follow suit very nicely right behind him. My question is, how can we get that perspective to flip to being more objective?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that they would have to really
Yeah.
and truly justify declaring a state of emergency.
So I think this will require legislation both at the state level and at the federal level, since both of those entities can assume certain kinds of powers. And in some ways, the powers assumed by governors exceed the powers assumed by the federal government under declared states of emergency. So it is extremely important to get this done at the state level and not just at the federal level. But I think it's going to require legislation that has a couple of components. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so better minds could go to work on this. But in general, I think it will require some clarity in defining what constitutes an emergency. And we can argue endlessly about where that threshold should be, but there has to be a threshold, right? Whether it's extremely high or whether we think it's too low, whatever, just having a threshold period that we can argue about would be a very good start. The second thing that legislation needs to contain, I think, is some process of legislative and or judicial review at periodic intervals, right? So, okay, if there's a new virus and people are dying and a hospital in Orange County is sounding the alarm, the governor can declare a state of emergency and put some measures in place to try to figure out what the heck is going on. But at some point, before too long, 2 weeks, 4 weeks into this thing, the courts have to take a look at it. Does this meet the criteria? And you can duke that out in the fact-finding process in the courts, and you can appeal if you don't get a favorable decision in the courts. And or the legislature has to take a look at this declared state of emergency and duke it out in the give and take of the legislative process. Are we going to extend this for another month? And so I think every time it's renewed, it cannot be just in the hands of one person, particularly in the hands of a person who benefits from the powers that are accrued, right? I declare the state of emergency as a governor, or I order my public health officer at the California Department of Public Health to do this. Since I appointed him to that office, he's going to do what I tell him to do. And I'm the one who ends up getting, more power in the wake of that declaration. That's an obvious recipe for a self-interested power grab that leads to a kind of tyrannical situation. And the genius of our government is to have these sort of three branches that can act as a backstop, to one or another branch doing this sort of thing entirely on their own. And so dealing with this whole question of state of emergency, I think we haven't thought very much about as Americans because, we haven't had it invoked very often in our history. But after the last 2 years, the way in which it was invoked hopefully will wake us up to the fact that this is something that can very easily be abused, right? Okay, something like this probably has to be in place for really, horrible, drastic, rare situations. But how do we make sure it's confined only to those and it's not extended month after month, year after year with no foreseeable end in sight?
So those are great suggestions, great ideas, so that when we're dealing with them, we just don't get called racist or sexist or what have you.
You're probably
End
still
of
going to get called
discussion as
those
far as
things.
them are concerned, right?
And I I would also add to what you were saying, Erin, is there has to be elements to what constitutes the emergency state and how it impacts our society. And really going back and looking at this, what we knew early on was that this virus was impacting the elderly population. There was also very clear evidence that there were early intervention treatments that were incredibly effective, cheap, and very much readily available. So you look at those elements and say, well, that clearly doesn't constitute a pandemic. And anyone who spent more than a couple of days at a scientific level, at a medical level, looking at this very early on in the pandemic with those data points, I think we probably could have gone back and said, this doesn't constitute a pandemic that we would shut down our entire economy, shut down the free movement of people within this country. And then further downstream, now looking at these vaccines, the fact that you can still acquire and transmit the virus even after having been vaccinated totally removes the concept of public health and safety off the table, right? So there's a lot, and sadly, we've talked about this, is very much by design what's happened with this state of emergency and why it continues to get extended.
One more comment on that. I think even under a state of emergency, there still have to be some guaranteed rights that are never abrogated or that are never suspended. And, right? There's no pause button on the Bill of Rights. And I would propose that among those constitutionally guaranteed rights is the right to consent or refuse a medical intervention, right? That's a right that should never be taken away from any competent adult that has decision-making capacity. If my ability to exist in society depends on the acceptance or refusal of a medical procedure, I am not a free human being, as far as I'm concerned. So, states of emergency, yeah, maybe very carefully boxed in, right? But even then, there are certain things that you can never, that the government can never do, and I think that has to be very clearly articulated in law.
And I would add to that, probably aside from the sacred right of being able to make your own medical informed decisions, also the sacred right of being able to make informed medical decisions for your child.
Yeah.
I cannot think of a more scary scenario, at least for me, than to have the government come in and tell me that they know how to raise my daughter, that they know what's medically better for her than I do. And if that doesn't scare every one of us, I believe that it does, though. So we'll leave it at that.
Okay, now you understand that this patent for these vaccines was patented in 2013. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
Okay. As a first responder, now since they're making it mandated, and of course I took a PGX test. That's why I didn't get the vaccine to work Super Bowl. My mom has not got the vaccine, and I already know this virus was actually to depopulate the population on this earth. So what are you doing to try to educate people more on what's going on? We already know the dates. We know that Fauci and a couple other individuals and the Gates are making a lot of money off of these vaccines. Are you exposing that part?
Yeah, I'll comment that.
I've had first responders that have died by taking the vaccine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you for that remark. So we cannot ignore the fact that there are global economic and political interests that saw in the pandemic an opportunity to advance their interests and to advance a certain agenda, right? And again, you don't have to come up with a really complicated conspiracy to account for that. If you just follow the money and you see what happened financially and you see who benefited, it becomes very clear I think what interests were operating and how they were operating. But a very clear conflict of interest in terms of our own government. Most Americans don't realize that the patent on the Moderna vaccine is co-owned by the NIH, specifically by Fauci's division of the NIH. There are 6 of his cronies within the NIAID who will get royalties for the rest of their life, and their children will get royalties for the rest of their lives from the revenues generated by this vaccine that the federal government authorized, recommended, and then encouraged states and other institutions to mandate. That's a clear financial conflict of interest, that his own budget and his coffers are being filled by a product that the Health and Human Services agencies, those three agencies, are meant to regulate. So this issue of regulatory capture, that these agencies are no longer independent of the industry, that they are supposed to keep in check. We expect a corporation to care about the bottom line and to try to make money on all of their products. That's how Pfizer and Moderna are going to behave. That shouldn't shock us, it shouldn't scandalize us, it shouldn't surprise us, and it shouldn't really be a problem so long as there's adequate safety metrics, so long as there's adequate research, which is done by the NIH or sponsored by the NIH, so long as there's an adequate review and authorization process. But when we can't count on those things, right, and we know the drug company is always going to act in their own interests, and they're going to minimize side effects, and they're going to spin the data to convince you that this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, then we have a problem, right? The problem is not a corporation trying to make money, because that's how corporations behave. The problem is the regulatory capture of these agencies by the industry that they are meant to regulate. And when that happens, we're in a very, very difficult spot. It's a form of corporatism, right? The corporations using the state to advance their own agenda, which was kind of the definition, at least that was Mussolini's definition of fascism. Right?
Yeah, and I think there's so many clear examples of this within this pandemic.
Do we have to wrap up here?
Thank you very much for your work as a first responder. I'll tell you, it's part of the Firefighters for Freedom, Nurses for Medical Freedom. So we have a lot of first responder strategic partners. And although I'm not at liberty to give any specific details, I will tell you that we are well aware of the PrEP Act. We are well aware of the violations that have occurred. And we also have some pretty strong and robust legal strategies that are happening right now to attack on multiple fronts with regard to the PrEP Act and the liability veil that the pharmaceutical companies have as a result of the PrEP Act. So I can tell you, again, I'm not at liberty to disclose those granular details, but I will tell you that, yes, we are well aware of that, and we have some very robust strategies.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry I have to cut off this discussion. I know it's very informative and interesting.
I'll take your question. We can take your question in a second.
But no, we have to get back over any other business to do. I'm sure you can
Nice job.
visit their website or send them an email, and I'm sure I won't have it around today. But I want to thank Laura and Erin for being here. Really appreciate it.